One of the most requested articles on my website has been the description of Isaiah's narrative concerning Messiah's beard being ripped out. In the prophecy of Isaiah 50 verse 6, the prophet describes the Messiah as he's beaten in his face and his beard is pulled out by his revilers. Isaiah writes, "I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out my beard." Isaiah 50 verse 6. We see the fulfillment of this prophecy in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 26 verse 67. "Then they spit in his face, and they beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands." Now, for some reason, there are people who are disappointed to read that Matthew does not mention specifically the text of Isaiah 50 verse 6, where it states that Jesus' beard was plucked out. Although there's no specific reference to anyone pulling out Jesus' beard with their hands as Isaiah described in the New Testament, it's for certain that this took place. The reason is that pulling out the beard of a condemned man before crucifixion was always a part of the humiliation process that was carried out against those who were crucified. And I'm going to share with you later in this video some of those things that took place. The fact that it was not included by Matthew is an apparent oversight on his part. But it's also great evidence for us that the testimony Matthew wrote is truthful. And let me tell you why. Now, think about this for just a moment, because there's a lot of insinuation that the Gospels were made up. But if a person was seeking to deceive us into thinking that his narrative of Jesus was genuine when it's not, the writer would know that the inclusion of Jesus' beard being ripped out was an absolute necessity to cause the reader to believe this false story he was trying to sell to the public. This is because all the Jews understood that this was going to take place for Messiah. Now, if, however, a person was simply writing a truthful narrative from what they remembered about the events that took place, they would not be capable of including every single thing that happened. No one can remember every single event from something that they've seen. We often see these differences in the New Testament when we're reading the different gospel accounts from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. One of these examples that proves the narrative of Jesus is genuine is observed in the New Testament by the difference in testimonies between Matthew and Peter's narrative of Judas, his suicide. Matthew describes Judas as hanging himself on a tree after his betrayal of Jesus. Peter, in the book of Acts, chapter 1, describes Judas as falling headfirst into a field with his intestines spilling out. Now, some critics of the Bible, they see these differences in this description of Judas' death as a discrepancy that they say casts doubt upon the reliability of the New Testament. So here we have Matthew that says Judas was hanged, and Peter says Judas fell headlong and he burst open in the middle and all of his entrails gushed out. So who is telling the truth? Why is there a difference here? These accounts of Matthew and Peter do not really conflict with each other. They are the records of the actual occurrences which took place, as each of these men described different parts of the same event as they remembered them. So Matthew recounts how Judas hanged himself, and that's the truth. That's what happened. Peter, he describes further details of this event where the rope that was used apparently broke, and Judas fell into the rocks of the field below. And apparently this fall ruptured his stomach area, spilling out his intestines onto the ground. And this is the reason we find out later that this field was called the field of blood. When different people are at the same scene of an incident, they will often remember different details of the same event. It's common for a person who is interviewing eyewitnesses to hear added details that others who were also present did not think of or didn't say. These differences are understood by experts, and they're looked for by them as a sign of consistent, true testimony. This is one of the methods that's used today by the FBI in trying to determine true from false written testimony. As we observe this phenomenon in Matthew and Peter's descriptions of Judas' death, we understand that these variations bring great credibility to their testimony as valid and authentic. These are accounts of the same event, but seen and remembered by two different individuals. There's no discrepancy between these two. They're simply additional details given by Peter, which Matthew did not mention. Now, if the story was a fabrication, those who wrote the lie would be careful to make sure that the accounts of all the witnesses were the same so as to remove any doubt about their authenticity. We see this in movies where we see people who are going to give testimony, they get together and they agree on what they're going to say. So here's Matthew. He's writing his narrative of Jesus for Jewish readers. That was the specific purpose of Matthew, to write to the Jews. And so it's my opinion that Matthew took for granted that his fellow Jews would know that Jesus' beard was going to be ripped out, because this always took place during crucifixion. And for this reason, he didn't feel that it was necessary to mention the obvious. Scholars agree that Isaiah's description is intended for the Messiah. It would have been very easy to add a description for Jesus having his beard torn from his face if the writers of the Gospels were seeking to convince any reader that Jesus was the Messiah. When we examine this text, by the absence of this description, it appears as if it was simply an oversight that occurred in the midst of recording all the other events described in the New Testament. Now, as I said before, these omissions of facts are often the case in eyewitness accounts. John wrote that there were many other things that Jesus did which were not recorded in the New Testament. In fact, John said that had everything been written that Jesus had done, all the libraries of the world could not contain them. John said this, "And there are also many other things that Jesus did, which if they were written one by one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." Amen. John 21:25. If there was a compilation of accounts for what occurred during the death of a person by individual witnesses, it would logically be possible that each person who observed the event would record different facts from their own unique perspectives. Some of these descriptions would be identical. Others would be similar but have added details not found in the other accounts. Still others would have important items that were missing entirely. Finally, it's completely reasonable that some things that would seem to be important to a person doing an investigation of facts after the event happened, such as pulling out the beard, that they might be missing from the record of all the witnesses and all of their accounts of every person who watched Jesus' crucifixion. As I stated earlier, Matthew had the greatest interest in presenting this, but he didn't need to, because he knew that the Jews assumed, it was understood, that the beard was always pulled out during crucifixion. It's a matter of the historical record that those who suffered the scourge and were later crucified often had their beards pulled out by their accusers. In fact, it very rarely didn't happen. It was considered part of the process that a condemned man, his beard would be pulled out as a sign of the total disdain for the condemned man's crimes. Men of this time period, they considered their beards as a mark of honor. There was no greater dishonor or insult to inflict upon a man than to pull out or cut off all or part of his beard. When the king of Ammon died, David sent his servants to comfort the king's son Hanun in his grieving. The princes of Hanun advised the king's son that David's intentions were not honorable. And in fact, he was sending spies to search out the city so that David could attack and overthrow Hanun's kingdom. So, thinking about this and believing the advice of his princes to be correct, this young king took the servants of David and shaved off their beards, cut off their garments to expose their buttocks, and sent them back to David. We see what this meant to David, having their beards cut off and so forth, by how he responded to that later. These actions were meant to be the highest insult to David and his kingdom. The fact of their complete humiliation is observed by the final words of 2 Samuel 10:5, where David instructs the men to wait in Jericho until their beards have grown back. Therefore, Hanun took David's servants, shaved off half of their beards, cut off their garments in the middle at their buttocks, and sent them away. And when they told David, he sent to meet them, because these men were greatly ashamed. And the king said, "Wait at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then return." This is from 2 Samuel 10, verses 4 and 5. So, as we examine history, we see that the removal of a man's beard was a great act of dishonor. And it's for certain that the Roman soldiers and those who opposed Jesus, they were going to do this to him because they wanted to dishonor him. It's a record of antiquity that men of this time period considered these actions the highest insult to their dignity. Tacitus recorded that to pull out the beard of any man for any reason was viewed as degrading and dishonorable. For this reason, it's certain then that during the crucifixion of Jesus, the Roman soldiers, who were known for their brutality, pulled out Jesus' beard in handfuls rather than take the time to cut it with a sharp edge of a knife. Now, since it was the goal of his tormentors to inflict as much suffering on Jesus as possible, and to insult and degrade him as a man before the people who were observing the crucifixion, they must have done exactly as this prophecy of Isaiah 50 verse 6 predicts. "I gave my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard." Now, a further area of interest in Isaiah's prophecy is observed when we study this by looking at the presence of death by crucifixion in the scriptures, described 600 years before it was even invented. The first crucifixion recorded in the Bible is described by King Darius about 520 BC. We read this as it's noted in the book of Ezra in chapter 6, verses 1 through 11. The fact that crucifixion had not been invented at the time David wrote these words in Psalm 22, describing the hands and the feet being pierced and the tongue sticking to the mouth, vivid descriptions of crucifixion. This gives us even greater astonishment when we consider that what David is writing for the future Messiah was a complete mystery to him personally. He'd never seen anybody be crucified because it didn't exist at that time. The common picture that is given to us for Jesus' crucifixion is that he was lifted up on a cross high above the ground, high above the crowd below. In reality, history records that the crucified were usually just a foot or two above the ground. It should be understood that the entire purpose of crucifixion was to humiliate the condemned by making their execution a visible horror. In the history of the Romans, in their annals of the Senate, Suetonius writes that those who were placed upon the cross were stripped of all of their clothing, exposing their genitals and allowing the people who were watching to witness the condemned as they relieved themselves while hanging upon the cross. Now, the result of this horrible torture brought insects that further tormented the dying and added to their shame. As people watched and as their eyes were fixed upon those who were suffering such great torture, many of them hated and despised these condemned criminals. And so this humiliation that they suffered, it added a certain amount of enjoyment to those who watched the criminals die. A part of the punishment for those who were placed on the cross was their close proximity to the crowd who were watching them die. The cross itself was only about 2 or 3 feet above the ground, placing the faces of the condemned near the eye level of their tormentors. So this would make it very easy for Jesus' tormentors to come up to him and rip out his beard as he was suffering there upon the cross. The nearness of the cross to the ground is confirmed in the Jewish writings of Yev 120b, which describes the official method for determining the actual moment of death for the condemned, so that the body could be taken down from the cross. Certain ancient Hebrew writings describe that one of the ways that death was determined to have occurred was by the presence of feral animals in the area who would come and begin to feed on the flesh of the feet and the legs of the person who was crucified. When they saw that happen, they knew that the crucified had died and the animals were now feeding on their flesh. So these animals were able to gain access to the dead on the cross because of their near proximity to the ground. It would be quite normal for any person who was watching Jesus being crucified, who held disdain for him, to come up as he's just a couple feet off the ground and also rip out his beard as he's dying as a criminal, as an act of their own personal contempt. Now, as we read in the scriptures about Isaiah's his prophecy of the Messiah, he also speaks of the Messiah being struck in the face by his accusers in this prophecy in chapter 52, verse 14. Under normal circumstances, when a human being sees a blow coming towards his face, the natural mechanism in the brain will cause the person to recoil his head backwards in anticipation of the strike that's coming to his head. This lessens the effects of the blow. But what if the person has lost their vision? What if their vision is obstructed, as it was in the case of Jesus? When they blindfolded him and then struck him in the face, there would be no opportunity for him to recoil and lessen the severity of the blows. When we think about this, it's really heartbreaking. Jesus experienced the full force of the punches which were targeted at his face, and he suffered grievous damage to his appearance. Isaiah writes about this more than 700 years before this event took place. Luke also writes, and he said, "And having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, 'Prophesy, who is the one who struck you?'" Isaiah writes, and he said that just as many were astonished at you, so his visage, his facial features, those of Jesus, were marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of man. In the literal Hebrew language, it means that Jesus didn't even look like a human being after they finished pulverizing him in the face. We think about you, Lord, how much you suffered for us. How great was your pain. By the exhibition of your suffering for us, you have shown us how great your love is. You know, it's important to think about what Jesus endured for us on the cross, because it helps us put our own life into a proper perspective. Jesus was not suffering for anything that he had done, but he was suffering for us, for you and for me. We are the ones that were guilty. The horrendous nature of Jesus' suffering should really speak volumes to us as to just how severe our situation was when he died. Had Jesus not taken our punishment at the cross, we would have all suffered ourselves extreme punishment for our own sins. We also see just how much God really loves us. For if the Father had not loved each one of us just as much as he loved his own dear Son, he never would have allowed Jesus to suffer so much. Anytime we forget or we doubt that God loves us, all we must do is look back to the cross and remember Jesus there, suffering for us. And we realize once again just how much God really does love us. I want to thank you for taking time today to watch this video about what Jesus has endured. I sincerely hope that you were encouraged in your own walk with the Lord, or if you have yet to come into a relationship with Jesus, perhaps this time that you've spent today hearing some of what Jesus endured for you will move you to receive him into your heart. You know, he loves you so much, and he is always waiting for you to want him and to take the next step to invite him into your life. I wrote the book, The Prophecies of the Messiah, about 3 years ago, with 400 of these types of prophecies that Jesus fulfilled as documented by the New Testament. You can find those at Amazon and also my website. I'll have the address for you at the end of this video. Thanks again for spending time with me, and may the Lord bless you in all of your days as you continue to seek him with all of your heart.